hours in meditation together. Today, we're going to do just some traditional shamatha or awareness practice. And then maybe in the future, we'll see if we can tie the lojong teachings into our practice sessions together. But just a quick word on this. Most of you are probably familiar with a basic mindfulness practice or a shamatha, which means a calm abiding practice, a way of training the mind to simply just be present, to sort of be here rather than projecting into the future or sort of reflecting and getting caught in our thoughts and impressions of the past. Now, I was thinking this morning why this is important and why I think a lot of Buddhist meditation, a lot of Buddhist teachings on meditation really start here. They start with awareness. And I really think, in my practice of lojong over the years, in these mind training teachings we're going to go into, they're just not possible without awareness, and having some development of that and increasing our present moment awareness. Just being born, just having this human body, we have awareness. So that's the good news, I like to point out the good news because sometimes the Buddhist path can present us with these things that seem like, how am I ever going to do that? Like in the lojong text, we're going to have some slogans, some phrases, which are like, when somebody attacks me, I see it as like a blessing or as a teaching. And it's like, this is really hard to do. So I think we have to honor our kind of natural gifts. And so one of our natural gifts as a human being is that we have a capacity for awareness. Now, the reason we have to practice it, and the reason it's sort of introduced and emphasized on the Buddhist path, is we can develop that awareness. We can increase it for our own well-being, for our own awakening, and also, of course, in these lojong teachings for co-awakening, or what I'm going to describe as sort of our interdependent community that we're coming into and we're trying to develop with bodhicitta. So for me, when we're working these lojong ideas and phrases and reflections and bringing them into our life, unless there's a strong sense of present moment awareness, we're just not going to be able to recognize the thoughts, the framings, the behaviors, the way we're relating to ourself and our world that are often limiting us. I mean, we could kind of sum up the whole lojong teaching, I feel, in just sort of working with our limitations and understanding that in a not just a oh, I'm limited, poor me, more like a joyful way. So I want to phrase it that way. Sometimes I feel these teachings can be a little bit of a downer, where it's like, for me, when I first encountered them as a new Buddhist practitioner or someone interested in it, I had a lot of self-confidence issues, shame issues to deal with. And so we have to, I'm gonna name this as we go through each week, but these are things that are going to come up. So how do we work with that? How do we find joy instead of shame when we're working with this? So not focusing on, well, I'm not there yet, or I have this inadequacy, and instead thinking, wow, I have the potential for this, right? And awareness is one of the components that gives us that agency, that gives us that efficacy. So I just want to frame it like that. Usually awareness practice or shamatha training is trained sort of in just stabilizing right our awareness in the present moment. But then the point in Mahayana Buddhism and in these lojong practices is then to actually use that awareness for the efficacy and agency of developing our wise, compassionate, loving heart, right? And that's really what lojong is about, combined with understanding how we get caught in our self-enclosure. And self-enclosure here, some people may call it ego. Sometimes we call it a reified I, or that kind of thing. Permanence, right? And this is going more to the wisdom teachings in Buddhism. But lojong has this incredible quality to connect these two wings of the method or practices of compassion and love to wisdom. And that's sort of what we're doing here. And I think awareness is that bridge, because if there's not awareness, then we're not going to be able to tackle our behaviors, states of mind, emotional reactions in a healthy way, right? So anyways, just a quick introduction, but of course we're going to talk about this a lot more. So let's do a little practice, and then we can, we'll take refuge, generate bodhicitta after that, and then get into the content. So go ahead and find a seat that feels good to you, that you can feel relaxed yet alert in. And just allowing yourself to come into the body in a safe and comfortable way. So what this means is, for me, it's not like, oh, I'm preparing myself to do something. I'm preparing myself to sort of be perfect, right? Perfectionism is one of these cultural conditions that we often are affected by, that is really damaging the meditation practice. So instead of like coming into, I want to be perfect in this practice or get something out of it, it's like, what can I engage? What can I train? What can I practice, right? And part of that is the body, coming into the body. So we're going to spend just the first part of this coming into the body, and I'll guide that. And so here you can close your eyes if you'd like. You can leave them open, whatever feels good to you. And just allowing the breath for a few moments to deepen, maybe allowing a 3 count on the inhalation, a 3 count on the exhalation. Now I want to invite you into a relationship with the breath that's embodied. So what this means is, where do you feel the breath the most right now? Do you feel it in your nose as the air passes in and out? Do you feel it in your lungs? Maybe for some people, they're used to more abdominal breathing. Do you feel it in your abdomen? And I just want to invite you into a connection with that. It's very simple. It doesn't have to be very conceptual. Just feel the breath in that part of the body, wherever you can relate to it right now. And it's good if you can choose a place where it feels somewhat neutral and or comfortable. If it's uncomfortable, switch it up. And so, as I said a few minutes ago, once we throw out the idea that we need to be concentrated, or we need to be perfect in the meditation, which for some might mean no thoughts, for others it might mean not getting distracted and kind of finding this space of eternal calm. So I want to invite you to get rid of those ideas, or at least just put them aside for now. I know they may come up. And what does this mean? This means that we simply just relate to our experience now, starting with the breath in the body. This is actually one of the first meditation teachings of the Buddha, part of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, part of mindfulness of breath. So wherever you've been relating to the breath in the body right now, either at the tip of the nose, feeling of the air passing into your lungs, the abdomen, we're going to begin to expand through the body. So if you're sitting in a chair with the feet flat on the ground, I want you to allow the breath to pass through your sense of presence in the feet. So we're going to have to connect with the feet here. If we're sitting cross-legged on a cushion, it could be the whole kind of lower half of our body, the feet, the calves, knees, our sits bones connected to the floor or cushion below us. What if you allow the breath to be felt there? And of course, the breath can't literally go there, but when you breathe in, allow your attention to connect with the lower body. When you breathe out, just release that, allowing a sense of presence on the out breath, almost a sense of letting be. So we're using this capacity for attention and awareness to train in a sense of embodiment. And I want to acknowledge here, this isn't easy for all of us. We live in an incredibly disembodied culture right now. So you may be noticing it's hard to be in the body. It's hard to be in the feet, to be in the legs. Your thinking mind just pulls you right out of there. And so the practice here is to lovingly come back. It actually doesn't matter too much if and how you become distracted from the breath and or body here. What matters is how we're going to interact with that. What kind of relationship do you want to form? So to me, a sense of love develops through care, attention. Not forcing, not also escaping. So allowing this capacity of mindfulness to remember and come back to the breath and the body, come back to the sense of the breath entering our feet, knees, legs, our seat. The inhalation draws us in there, and the exhalation, without lifting us out of there, allows us to settle and let be within the body. So if this was a traditional shamatha or kama abiding practice, this would kind of be the anchor or object of our attention or awareness. But don't think of it right now as a concentration practice. Think of it more as a being practice. We're training in being. So we'll practice like this for another 10 minutes. Just silently together. So just continuing to allow ourselves to feel the feet, the legs, the seat below us, allowing the breath to act as a connector there. Drawing us into the lower body on the in-breath, allowing us to simply be on the out-breath. And being here also means feeling. Just feeling whatever you're feeling. Doesn't have to be anything specific. Maybe it's just feeling the floor. The sensation of your feet on the floor, the sensation of the seat below you. Now just allowing the breath to fade into the background, and see if you can put the majority of your attention and awareness on the body, on the sensation you've been connecting to, maybe the seat, maybe the sense of your feet touching the floor or earth. And again, remembering this is a practice, so definitely you're probably going to get distracted and lifted out of the body and just come back, drop back in. And we merge our awareness with the feeling. So there's a sense of watchfulness, not watching. Watchfulness is when the awareness and feeling come together. Watching is dissociated, a little bit disembodied. It's the way I define it. So as you allow the breath to fade to the background, you let the sense of embodiment come to the foreground. Again, the practice is simply just to stay with the feeling. Let it be what it is. Let it ebb and flow. Maybe other kinds of energies, sensations start arising. For me, sometimes as the nervous system calms, I could even feel a sense of bliss in the body, a sense of like a pleasant sensation. So whatever is coming. For some, it may be unpleasant. That's also welcome. It doesn't have to look a certain way. But of course, if it becomes overwhelmingly unpleasant, just move somewhere else in the body and or just come out of the body for a moment. Look around the room. Whatever you need to resource here. We'll just spend another 30 seconds to a minute with this. And from this practice now of connecting to the lower body, we're going to come into our heart center, if that feels okay for you and comfortable. And it's hard to do that with just the attention and awareness, bringing the attention and awareness to feeling the heart center here, meaning the middle of the chest. You can also bring a hand, your left or right hand, whatever feels good, just putting it over the center of your chest. And we're going to do some more formal chanting in a moment, which connects us to our intention of love. But we're going to do this in an embodied way first. So just feeling your heart right now, just as you felt your feet. And heart, I don't mean the muscle. I mean your heart of love, your heart of emotion, of sensitivity, of interconnectedness. And for some of us, maybe a heart of sadness or a heart of pain or constriction. Just acknowledging that these are also parts of our interconnection. Not like only the pleasant stuff, only the good stuff, happy stuff is part of the practice. It's all part of the practice. So just feeling what you're feeling. And within this, knowing that we have the potential for love, no matter what, the potential for care, for warmth, for ourselves, for others, even if we're not feeling that so strongly at the moment. There's a wonderful story I'd like to share with you as we sit with our hearts right now. A wonderful Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Mingyur Rinpoche was teaching on our innate capacity for love, somewhere in the United States or Europe. And he teaches that we already have this sense of love, of compassion, of wisdom within us. It's part of our Buddha nature, our basic goodness. There was a man that came up to him at the end of the talk and said, I really liked what you were saying, but I don't feel that at all. I actually hate myself. I don't feel any love for myself. And Mingyur Rinpoche said, oh, that's interesting. So why did you come here? Why did you come to this teaching? And the man said, I wanted to learn more how to work with this, how to love myself. And Mingyur Rinpoche pointed out, the act of just showing up to this teaching or wanting to show up in itself is an act of self-love. So coming into this sense, this felt sense again in our heart center, just acknowledging that whatever you feel right now, whether it's a strong sense of care and warmth for yourself or others, the point is we all showed up here today. And this is already a strong intention of love, of care. And I just want you to remember that right now, to connect with that. And if you can connect that to the body, great. If you can't, it's fine to just reflect on that, to bring that up as an intention for why we're here. We're here because we love. And just taking a deep inhalation through the nose, a deep exhalation out of the mouth. Just allow the practice to come to rest. You can open your eyes, take a look around the room, do any stretching that feels good to you. Okay. So thank you, everyone. While Mary gets the sort of preliminary chants ready, I'm just going to give a short introduction to this. Now, I think most of you are familiar with maybe why we chant in what I call living lineage-based Buddhism. I sometimes use the word traditional Buddhism, and I realized it's a little bit inaccurate. Instead, it's like a living lineage Buddhism, that actually Buddhism is in process. And maybe I can add the word, I could put an S at the end of Buddhism, Buddhisms, because there's not a singular Buddhism. Buddhisms are in process. We have all these living lineages that come through human beings and are also embedded in the sutras and shastras, the words of the Buddha and the commentaries of the Buddha, as well as commentaries by Tibetan masters and other masters and other lineages. And in living lineage Buddhism, there's all these wonderful methods for engaging our Buddha nature, for bringing about this potential for awakening, chanting being one of them. And a lot of people, some people connect with this. They already like these kinds of things. Some people really resist it. And so I'm kind of talking to both here, because I think having a little framework for why we do it can help, whether we're resisting it or whether we like it. And the idea here is that chanting is actually a form of practice. It's a form of meditation. It's a form of embodiment, where it doesn't, when we understand what we're doing, it's not meaningless, it's not empty. And it allows us a chance to dive into a reflection through the voice, through the reverberation of the words in the body, and through the meaning of the words in the mind. So when we chant, we actually reflect on the meaning. We try to embody the intention of what the words are saying, right? And we allow the heart to open. So chanting is a really wonderful way to connect less conceptually into some of these things. So as you'll see as we go through the lojong teachings, I'm really interested in how we can bring these teachings from the head to the heart. right? As one of my students says, this is like that 15-inch drop. She calls it the 15-inch drop. I think something like that. It's like 15 inches from here to here. But both are important. Contextualizing, having an understanding is helpful, but we also need to experience. So I feel chanting is one of those bridges. Chanting is also a way to connect to the lineage. And so what we're going to do here is refuge and bodhicitta. So if you're not Buddhist at the moment, obviously you don't have to chant these. You don't have to feel obligated to. And there's a lot of meaning here in both the refuge and bodhicitta, as well as the mandala offering we'll do. But just briefly, refuge is where we're seeking safety. And in Buddha Dharma, we try to sort of transform where we're seeking safety by understanding that a large part of our current predicament is we're seeking safety in behaviors, states of mind, environments that don't create safety ultimately, right? They don't actually form a safe space. And here what we do is we reflect on the Buddha, not just in the historical Buddha, but the principle of a Buddha, an awakened being, which we can also awaken our potential for that. The Dharma, which allows that to develop, and then the Sangha, or the community that are also helping us to develop those qualities. And so we take refuge in that as a Buddhist. And then bodhicitta, we're going to talk a lot about in lojong, but this is that heart-centered approach to our interconnected awakening, that our awakening is not a solo project. And so we train in the mind of wishing or aspiring to awaken that's inclusive in a way to awaken for the benefit of others. And that's really what this chant is about embodying when we're chanting it. Mandala offering is a very beautiful, amazing practice. And here what we do is we imagine the world, our environment, the room we're in, our bodies, our states of mind, all transforming into whatever we can relate to as like excellent and extraordinary and beautiful and inspiring, something that awakens a sense of appreciation and awe within us. So obviously beautiful is subjective. So this can be whatever you find beautiful. And we transform all of that and we offer it up. So what we're working with is transforming our perception of how we're viewing ourselves in the world. And then we're offering that transformed awe, beauty, depth, appreciation to everyone, including all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So it's an offering to ourselves, it's an offering to everyone here, it's an offering to all beings, and of course it's an offering to the enlightened beings as well. Even they don't particularly need our offering, but we're offering it as a way to connect with them, as a way to, you can almost say it's like the mandala is what opens to the teaching, right? In a sense that in order to study Dharma, we have to have a certain amount of skepticism, of course, but we really need also a sense of openness, a sense of a willingness to seek out of the box. And I'm going to mention that a lot throughout these teachings. So the mandala is kind of an embodied, vocal mind, a body, speech, mind way to open to the teachings. So we'll chant them now. We'll do the refuge and bodhicitta once in Tibetan and twice in English, and then we'll do the short mandala once in Tibetan, once in English. Okay. Sangye chodang sogi chonama chanshu bardu dani kyamsu chi Tagi chunin gi pe sonam gi chola penjur sangen drupar sho. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until enlightenment to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Just let that sit with you for a second. The mandala, here you can use your capacity of imagination. Just like I said, imagining sort of this awareness, this perception that we see to develop into pure perception. And we offer it in the form of Mount Meru and the four continents. Saji peki jushin meto cham shira linji nide genpandi sangye jindo mite buaryi choko namda jina choparsho. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all beings enjoy this pure land. So kind of coming back to this heart of love, this feeling that we're all gathered here as a way to train the mind in wisdom and love, to study the Dharma, and then to experience it by merging it with meditation and practice. And all of this is done with the aspiration that we may know our nature, that we may awaken for the benefit of all beings. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Just to talk about the format of these Zoom sessions a little bit too is today I think I'll jump into the material a little bit, the introduction to lojong, as well as we'll cover the first verse today. And then depending on time, we'll either do, there's not so many people here, so maybe we won't do breakout rooms. So I was thinking to do breakout rooms on Zoom. Maybe we can just kind of chat as a group, and then we can do some Q&A. Let's just see how time goes. So as I said, lojong or the mind training tradition, maybe I didn't say this, lojong is this rich tradition, actually coming from Indian Buddhism, really, it looks like historically kind of becoming popularized within Tibet, and by popularized, just being widespread, right? So we have great masters like Langri Tangpa, Geshe Chekawa, Tisha Dipankara, as well as many, many others who wrote personalized texts, commentaries, sort of almost poetic ways of working with transforming what can seem like adversity into actually our awakened path. And lojong, I mean, it literally translates as mind training, lojong. And what I want to point out here is a distinction between what we might think of as mind in the West and mind in a Tibetan or Buddhist reference. So in the West, we might think of mind as sort of only thought-based and or material in the brain, right? Like materialized in the brain and sort of more thought-based. And here in Tibetan Buddhism and or just Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism as a whole, mind also implies a kind of a heart mind. It implies not just thought, but consciousness as a form of kind of like how we can perceive, how we know, how we can know, and also a sense of like, I would say there is an embodied sense of mind within Buddhism. When we say bodhicitta, for instance, it's sort of like referencing this heart mind or awakened heart mind. When we define mind sort of philosophically in Buddhism, we define it as clear knowing. But that knowingness can also be a sense of not just conceptual knowing, but non-conceptual knowing. And non-conceptual knowing can refer to sort of knowing the nature of something beyond thought. But it can also refer, I think, to these kind of embodied wisdom we develop. So maybe some of you in the practice experienced some kind of knowing within the body, right? Because we were hanging out in the lower body. And maybe there was a sense of like you knew something, but it wasn't through the thought, right? It wasn't through the thought process. It was through a felt knowing. So this is also included. So when we say mind training, and now again, this might be totally, I'm taking a little bit of a leap here. So, so go with me, because you might have received lojong teachings before. You're like, I never heard of that before. But think about it. Like, this is what this kind of, when we kind of look out of the box a little bit or open our minds a little bit, doesn't that make sense? To me, it makes sense. Like in my practice of lojong, that when I'm working mind training, it's not just my thoughts, it's my behaviors, my emotions. And emotions are connected to sensation. They're connected to the body. So I just want to throw that out there for kind of inquiry. And maybe it's a good time to say this. The way I tend to teach Dharma these days is more like offering information and or connection and sharing as a way to inquire into our lives, as a way to inquire into our realities, as a way to inquire into what are the causes for happiness and what are the causes for suffering, and how do we work with that. So anything I say is more like a prompt for your inquiry. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's one of them. And this prompt of like lojong is mind training, but mind is more than just thought, right? So we have this rich tradition, like I was saying, coming from Indian masters into Tibet, and really lojong, I think of it as kind of more advanced teachings. They're taught really openly and publicly now, widely throughout the world. When you come into Buddhism, I see, people using the slogans, and that's all great, and that's wonderful. But for me, these have been really difficult teachings to implement. Like on a personal level, I haven't had an easy time with lojong teachings. The reason being is I think they're quite challenging to us in the West, when we have a very strong conditioning of individualism, and a very strong conditioning of built-in sort of, like I said, quite a few of us can experience strong shame and disconnect from the body, and senses of low self-confidence, and disassociation from others. And I'm not naming those as a way to reify our experience. I'm naming those as a way to have compassion for our experience. I mean, this is sad, but it's not like we're sad. It's sad that we have to experience this culturally. Now, the positive news is we can shift this. This is changeable, but we have to acknowledge it. So when I first came in an encounter with the lojong teachings, they're very inspiring to me, but they can often go down a dark path, if we're not careful, of self-diminishment when we're already feeling diminished for some of us. Does this make sense to some of you? Yeah. And what do I mean by that? Because this is a very subtle point where, yes, we are working in Buddhism with our sense of self, and with our sense of how we identify with that, and how we reify that, and sort of attach to that. But there's a very subtle distinction here, is that there is a healthy sense of self that we need to relate to. This is acknowledged in Buddhism. If there's not a healthy sense of self, there's no hope, and hope is okay. What we're working with in Buddhism is reducing our expectation. So what I feel is like reducing expectation through the Dharma, increasing hope. Because right now, we need hope for awakening. We need hope for interconnection and well-being and happiness, and reducing suffering and eliminating it. So I just want that out there, that I'm going to teach lojong a bit differently, because the verses, for me, when I first read these, evoked a sense of like, because I had a strong connection to my teachers, and still do, there was a sense of like, I really want to do what this teacher says. I really want to follow them. I really think this is an incredible being who's teaching me this. And so there was this wish to enact these lojong teachings, but also, like, as you'll see as we go through them, they can easily trigger a misunderstanding of how we're working with ourselves. Meaning, like, some of them are saying, I think it's verse 3 or 4, putting ourselves lower than others. This can really get confused in Western culture, right? If we don't understand the true meaning of what this is getting at. So I don't want to belabor the point too much, but just to get in, say a few more things. Here we have to look at how a culture behaves, and how a culture is embodied, like how the culture functions in the body. And if one thing, I think a lot of us, we get attracted to Tibetan Buddhism through Tibetans, because we see, wow, this looks like a really happy person, quite sane, quite, open, smiley, right? Like, like that. And I think a lot of us kind of initially, we have so little self-love that when we see that, we're like, wow. And I want to say that's good news, because the fact that we see it and can acknowledge that means we already have love, right? Just we're struggling with it. And I noticed, for me early on in Tibetan Buddhism, and I've heard this from other people, it's like almost like we can think a Tibetan person's enlightened because they're kind of happy and okay and light, but that's not what enlightenment is. They're just a healthy human being, which is possible for us too, if we don't feel that right now, or maybe we feel that right now, which is great. So I just want to acknowledge that feeling okay in our body and feeling connected to each other and open and loving, this is not necessarily enlightenment. It's just a human capacity we can connect with and grow. And yet I would say it's the basis of enlightenment as well. It's like, if that's not there, it's really difficult to traverse the path. So with these lojong teachings, again, to connect the dots, if there's not a sense of okayness, and I'll describe okayness more if you want me to, a sense of okayness in the body, which is just a sense of, my teacher Sonam Rinpoche says, like feeling a sense of happiness for no reason, right? Just okay. That doesn't mean we don't have suffering, or we don't get sad, or we don't experience ups and downs. It just means generally there's a sense of okayness. Actually, I'm defining okayness for me now, where it's the capacity of the heart to break open when there's pain, when there's sadness, when there's suffering in my own mind and in the world, and yet not break down. That's how I'm defining okayness for me. So there's more space we create around the heart, for the heart to break open, not break down. And to me, this happens through a sense of interconnection with others. And I did not feel that 20 years ago when I started Buddhist practice. So I just want to acknowledge that change is possible for us, but it does take work. It does take practice. So just sitting in our self-loathing of, I'm so miserable, that sounds great, but how am I going to get there, is not helpful for you if you're thinking or feeling that right now. We have to do something about it, right? And so lojong can also help with that, I think. But just to go back to this context, cultural context, they are more advanced teachings for that reason. I had to put lojong down for a while and just sort of deal with my own, lack of self confidence. And then I came back to lojong and I felt, wow, okay, now this makes sense. So you have to see where you're at, but that doesn't also mean we can't study lojong. We can't put it into practice and do both at the same time. So I just want to point out, because some people might think, well, I'm just going to sign off right now and I'll see you in a couple of years. No, you don't have to think like that. It's like we can still engage them, but I'm trying to introduce a framework where when the mind states come up in you, when you're practicing these verses, where it starts to go down what I call kind of the dark path of the heart, you can acknowledge that and say, oh yeah, okay, Scott was talking about that this might happen. And then what you can start to do is acknowledge your pain and start to reference compassion for you. So it's almost like lojong, I think culturally for us, has to be done in relation to us first. Where typically the lojong teachings start in Tibetan Buddhism by working with others. That's because one has already worked out your own stuff enough, and then you can start to work with others more. Make sense? Yeah? Okay. So today, kind of, I titled this talk, Live a Meaningful Life. Just as kind of an introduction to like, what is meaning from a Buddhist perspective? What is it? What is meaning making? What is meaningful? What does it mean to live a meaningful life from a Buddhist perspective? So I'd like to go into that a little bit. And I think this is a little bit controversial territory, because in the West, we're conditioned that like whatever you think makes meaning is meaningful. Now, I just want to throw that out there. Is that true? For your inquiry, and we don't have to, I mean, I'm sure some of us are like, no, yes, right away, but just leave it for a moment. Like, let's sit with that. I mean, I'm still sitting with that. I have my own kind of, hypothesis around it, but I'm still sitting with that, whether we each have our own individual meaning making, and we could say, in a way, I think for sure we have each our own path of meaning making. Like, your path of engaging the Dharma and what you have to work with, and using the Dharma to work with your mind and heart, might be a little different than mine. And so in that way, the meaning making can be slightly different. But what brings meaning can also be complex. And it's sort of like, I think meaning is in relationship to what we're seeking, right? Like what are we trying to do with our life? So, for someone who just wants really nice material possessions, maybe meaning making is around making money, right? like a meaningful life is how much money you can accumulate. And then they get to that place where they reach the goal where they have a really nice house and enough cars and can vacation and do whatever they want to do, and that's their sort of end point, right? Now, Buddhism's so interesting because the end point is infinite. I'll say that again: the end point is not an end point in Buddhism. And this is what's so tricky, because we recite chants like we just did, aspiring for enlightenment, etc. And so it seems like we're goal orienting to enlightenment, which is this thing that's out there that's going to happen at a certain moment. But enlightenment is not in a moment. It exists beyond past, present, future. It doesn't exist in any kind of conceptualized dualistic format. So it's kind of like a little bit of a trick of the path, because right now we have dualistic thinking. So we need to use that in a positive way to have hope for something, right? But with that said, when we're talking about something that's infinite and kind of expansive, like this idea how the universe keeps expanding, I think the heart of bodhicitta just continues to expand as our realization expands, as our connection to others and ability to benefit through wisdom and compassion expands. Also, meaningfulness expands, right? But of course, we need some temporary definitions just to get on the same page, right? But I just want to put that out there. For Buddhism, to me, Buddhism is at its best when it's blowing my mind, right? If in any way Buddhism is like limiting me and boxing me in, or making me more rigid and or judgmental, I feel this is like an anti-path for me, and it's a real tricky thing, because when we learn the Dharma, a lot of the learning comes in by like, this is how it is, or there's this, and you believe this, and you do this, and this is how you prostrate, and this is how you do a mangal offering, and it's like, that's all fine. Like, I think a wonderful example in the Zen tradition is like, there's a ritual around like how someone might bow and or hold a stick of incense when they're offering it. But the practitioner also has to know that that is interdependent, and therefore it's not this sort of not getting stuck in the relative, but they still use the relative, right? So relative here means something that is based on cause and effect. And so it has efficacy for us, right? Like doing the lojong practice, or meditating, or learning the way we're learning. But we can also understand it as simply a step in a direction, right? That eventually is taking us beyond the step. No? So a step in a direction that is meant to take us beyond that step. And I think this is where Dharma becomes very wide, because we understand there is a path that we can engage, and there's multiple paths actually in Buddhism, but that we can engage, and this has efficacy for us and agency, but also not reifying that and trying to squeeze the crap out of that. Does that make sense? And this is where I think living lineage-based Buddhism, or what some might call traditional Buddhism, it's a little bit failing the younger generations at this point, because whenever something becomes institutionalized, it takes on this flavor of rigidity. And it's not that it's rigid in and of itself. It's just pointing out a path that we need. Just like I often tell people when they're anti-path, I'm like, well, maybe try not putting gas in your car for a few months and see what happens, right? They're not going to do that, because that's a step of what they need to get to work, or to get to the grocery store, or whatever, right? It's very similar with Buddhism. It's just we're putting in the actions and the steps for what functions on a relative level, but we don't want to squeeze it at the same time. And this is where I think Buddhism as an inquiry-based tradition really helps, because we take in the teachings we learn, but we sit with them and then they expand over time through practice and study. And that's essentially what I recommend, right? And I think there needs to be a new way to start thinking about this. And it's actually more of a pedagogy issue. The one Lama, Dzongtse Khyentse Rinpoche, he says Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit stuck in 100-year-old pedagogy, frozen in ice, that needs to sort of understand how to relate to the modern world more. And what's wonderful is we are seeing that. There's wonderful lamas and geshes and kempos who are stretching themselves in how to present and how to develop pedagogy to meet modern people. And I don't think it's just a East-West problem. I think younger Tibetans are also struggle to meet, some of these older pedagogy forms of pedagogy in Buddhism. So meaning making in Buddhism for me, and again, this is a big topic, so it can go into a lot of areas, and lojong has a very specific way of meaning making. It has to do with where we're putting our hope, our expectation, what we're looking to and relying on for happiness, and what we're sort of relying on to remedy or reduce our suffering. And I think it's really that simple. And again, you could say every spiritual path or religion is sort of, presenting some point of view on this, how to gain happiness, how to work with suffering. Buddhism is very specific in this idea of Buddhahood or awakening, right? That meaning making is in relationship to how much we are understanding our predicament and enacting a path or a set of actions and practices to wake up out of that. A little bit like being in a nightmare and enacting the sort of steps and the practices to understand we're in a nightmare, first of all, to just, because a lot of people can be in a nightmare and you just don't know you're in one, right? You're just in it. So we're enacting the steps and practices and stages and learning, reflection, and meditation to understand we're in a nightmare, and then start to make steps to get out of that nightmare. Those are the first things. Then the main thing, what brings the real meaning, is understanding a nightmare or a pleasant dream is still a dream. And then we take the steps to get out of the dream state completely and wake up, right? But first we have to work with just shifting from a nightmare to a more neutral or pleasant dream. And that's included in Buddhism, right? It's included. So I wanted to talk a little bit about predicament here, but predicament in relationship to potential. And again, these are kind of, I would say, foundational Buddhist teachings that some of you are familiar with. But again, kind of trying to get out of the box together, maybe we can reflect on them in a different way. So I've been reflecting on this, in Tibetan Buddhism, at least my entrance to it, I didn't, I started off in being introduced to like deity yoga practices and, mantra practices and a lot of philosophy and kind of, philosophy on emptiness, philosophy on these kinds of things, lojong. And then of course, with we call them either the fourth aspects that turn the mind, or in the Lam Rim, some of you might know this as the lower and medium scopes. Of course, the idea of dukkha, and dukkha meaning this sort of structure of dissatisfactoriness, the structure of suffering, what that means, how we're engaging with it, how we're stuck in it, how we can unstick from it. So until I sat with the lower and medium scopes of Lam Rim, it wasn't really that generative for me. So I had to sit in retreat eventually with that, and that really helped to sort of understand my predicament a little bit more. But still, until I centered dukkha as sort of not only the Buddha's first teaching, within the First Noble Truth, but until I centered it as like, wow, okay, it's almost like there's a gate closed to some of the higher teachings that we might be introduced to, like Vajrayana tantric practices, things like that. Until I centered dukkha, that didn't open. So it's sort of like, that's where I think Buddhism gets a bad rap, because it sometimes, where because we talk about the predicament a lot in the beginning. We talk about where we're suffering, how, why, all of that kind of thing. And sometimes it can get stuck in the pessimism that, oh, okay, we're just talking about this. But then again, it's kind of like, we emphasize that part for ourselves when we hear it, but don't emphasize the part where the Buddha said, and there's a cause of this and we can get out of this, right? So within understanding the predicament of our human life, essentially, we have to understand both how we get stuck and that there is a possibility, potential to get out. And for some of us, we need to emphasize different, the latter and the former at different times in our practice. Like for me, sometimes I lean more on the sort of predicament itself of how dukkha functions in my life, how suffering functions in the mind and the body, in my relationship to karma, cause and effect. And then sometimes I reflect more on the positivity that I have the potential to awaken. So you need to see what you need in different moments and how to emphasize that. I would say for in Gampopa's Lamrim, one of the great Kagyu lineage masters, he emphasized Buddha nature first. And I think this is quite skillful for a lot of us, because Buddha nature is the good news. It's sort of like that suffering is temporary, but our underlying nature is awake. Our underlying nature has all the makings for awakening. And if we don't emphasize this, all the teachings on suffering and the nature of suffering can just become too depressing, I think. So I'm going to talk about Buddha nature first a little bit. And so, like I said, like you choose what you need to reflect on more. Like sometimes it's like where we need to uplift the mind and sort of the hope, maybe is another way to put it, where we need to increase the hope. And sometimes where we need to increase the sobriety, right? Like the soberness of what life is and what our experience is. So Buddha nature, what's so interesting is the Buddha taught Buddha nature in what we refer to more as like the third turning of the wheel. Now again, a first, second, and third is only oriented later, right? It's only sort of codified and contextualized later in Mahayana Buddhism. Nonetheless, I think it's a good context for us. And so the first turning is really referring to the Pali Canon, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, four foundations of mindfulness, renunciation, these kinds of things. The second turning, the teachings on the view of emptiness, expanding that beyond anatta, which is taught in the first teaching, but expanding that into the emptiness fully, as laid bare in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And this is where, in Tibetan Buddhism, mostly what we study, we get our teachings on the middle way teachings from here. And then the third turning, based on the previous two, so the second is based on the first, the third is based on the first and the second. The third turning really emphasizing Buddha nature. And for some schools, emphasizing the potential. Some schools in Tibetan Buddhism emphasizing more the potential for awakening and what Buddha nature is. And then some schools actually emphasizing more the appearance aspect, or sort of that when you cut through the solidity of self and phenomena, it doesn't mean nothing's there. It doesn't mean it's just sort of void. And so Buddha nature teachings for some are a way to understand the way perception happens, even when we've cut through the solidity of our perception. So Buddha nature is also a way to do that. But first, in the Buddha nature teachings, like in Uttara Tantra, which is one of the major texts on Buddha nature, really what it points out is the benefits of reflecting on Buddha nature. And that's really what I want to emphasize here. That we use these analogies to describe Buddha nature, like gold and ore, or like the sun behind clouds. Tibetans use the example of like butter within milk. So you can see all of these examples are there for as analogies for us to reflect on our inner potential. That Buddha nature is like the sun behind clouds, that which becomes a very useful way to explain our predicament, because you have this sun, but we can't see it right now because it's obscured, right? Or we have the gold within the other minerals and rock and dirt and material, but we need to do something to remove the dross, so we have the pure gold, being our Buddhahood, right? Same when we have this example of, Tibetans used to, still do probably in some areas, they churn milk they have a process to churn it into butter. And so there's that process of churning. There's that process of enacting something to bring about what's natural within the milk. Because the butter is not separate from the milk, but there's some activity happening in order to refine it and remove what it's in the way of becoming butter. So essentially we're trying to become butter. That's the meaning. That's what I'm trying to say. But anyways, so these are good examples to reflect on our potential as a human being, because I think the best news in Buddhism is that we are not originally screwed up. We're actually originally awakened. And this is a really good news. Now, schools debate about whether that means there's the original potential for awakening, or that we are simply just awakened and we just need to remove the obscuration. So there is some debate on that. But to me, that's an important debate, but it doesn't really matter too much for this reflection, because we're just reflecting on our potential. We're reflecting on the possibility that I'm not this screwed up sentient being, screwed up person that I think I am, right? And that there may be this way to think and view what our possibilities truly are. And to me, this is definitely around making meaning, because if we don't have the possibility of what we can bring about in our life, it's kind of empty and meaningless and very depressing. Like, again, I find, again, I don't mean to complain about Western culture so much, because there's also good things. But I find a lot of the view nowadays incredibly nihilistic and depressing, because when a view sort of orients more and more to the material, there's not really, and the belief of anything beyond the material sort of is sort of dead in the water. There's nowhere to go. It's just everything ends, right? There's nowhere to go. Where in Buddhism, we believe consciousness is not just material, and that consciousness is something that can't be destroyed. So to me, that's good news, right? And then, of course, we inform that with, and consciousness's original nature is free, is awake. And that's what Buddha nature means. I like to point out, too, for those of you who are kind of like Buddhist curious, but not necessarily Buddhist, Buddha nature doesn't mean Buddhist, because the word Buddha means awakened, right? Or free or enlightened or whatever you want to call it. So it doesn't mean Buddhist. It just means this potential all beings have to be free, right? And then, of course, it gets tricky to get into the definitions. Well, what does being free really mean, right? And of course, that's the more deep end teachings on emptiness in Buddhism. We'll get into in these 8 verses. So that's the good news. And I think we need to take time as a practitioner to reflect on that. And then we can reflect on the predicament, which is the clouds. So it's sort of like balancing out when we're reflecting on the sun, like ourselves and our potential as the sun. And then when we need to see, okay, well, I'm definitely not experiencing that sun right now. Like, we have to be honest with ourselves, right? Doesn't feel like, doesn't feel very, very bright out today. It feels quite, rainy and, bogged down. And so that's when we start to relate with the clouds. So a lot of the Buddha Dharma and making meaning actually is in our relationship to the clouds, or is in our relation. We have also the example like the lotus in the mud, right? It's in our relationship to the mud and working with the mud. Now, I'll put something out there that kind of is going to be a little bit more, hopefully, direct and simple for you to think and reflect in your life and make it more embodied, and then I'll get complex from there. In a practical way, for me, what this means is what I said earlier, is simply allowing a connection to our full humanity, our emotional pain, our rampant thoughts, our physical pain, and allowing a connection where there's a curiosity around it, where we can develop space as we deal with brokenheartedness, as we deal with sadness, as we deal with disconnect, whatever we're feeling that creates more, that is feeling like separation, that is feeling like disconnect. And so what I mean by relating to the clouds is, of course, we have all the teachings to conceptualize this and think about it and reflect on it. But what it really comes down to is all those teachings are there to start to form a relationship to our lived experience, which includes thought, which includes feeling, emotion, perception, right? And we have this teaching on the five aggregates. It just includes whatever we experience through those five aggregates. I'm not going to go into those right now, but I could if you want later. So that's what we're engaging. And this to me is also another way where the path becomes quite rich. Because I think the challenge for us as Western Buddhists is to get out of our heads, please. That's really the challenge. But it's also part of that challenge is we still need to learn. Like, we're here for a reason, there's information we can take in to inform our path, to inform our inquiry or our curiosity in our practice. That's important too. So that, it's just a balance of these. So I call this kind of relating to the clouds, I call this our predicament, and of course we have these three types of suffering, I think, as a wonderful way to use some information from the Buddha to reflect on our own experience, where we have, reflecting on our gross suffering, that it appears, that it's there. We're relating to it. We're trying to meet it in the body. We're trying to meet it in our experience and not simply become it, but also not resist it. Just simply offer some curiosity around it. And that happens through meditation, obviously. But then there's these subtler layers of the suffering of change, or the dukkha of change. And then the dukkha or suffering of the dissatisfaction of all pervasiveness, right? So this one of change, I think, is when we actually start to get into the deeper aspects of what Buddhism represents. Because happiness and suffering are in relation to each other. They lean on each other. They're dependent on each other. So actually, if we're seeking happiness, we're not going to be able to transcend suffering either. And this is kind of bad news, but good news, right? Kind of bad news because, like, we love to market Buddhism with happiness, 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 because a lot of people don't have another way to understand, like, why they would want to do this kind of thing. And I think I use the word happiness loosely, where sometimes we can talk about, like, more ultimate happiness. And this is where I think it gets a little mind-boggling for people, because if we say, okay, well, if I'm not trying to get if I don't want suffering, but I don't want happiness, what are we doing here, right? And that's where, of course, it gets more into the deep end Buddhism. But nonetheless, we can offer the question or the inquiry, is enlightenment happiness? The Buddha described enlightenment in a certain way when he attained it. There's one kind of account. I'm looking for the quote now. I usually have it memorized, but my brain isn't working today very well. So the Buddha, on his awakening under the Buddha, under the Bodhi tree, some of us might know this story where the god Brahma and I think Indra came to him and requested the teaching and requested him to teach the Dharma, and the Buddha kind of refused for the first 2 times, right? And they had to request him 3 times. And upon his refusal, this is what he said: profound, peaceful, beyond constructs, luminous and unconditioned, I've found a nectar-like Dharma. Whomever I teach it to will not understand, so I'll stay silent here in the forest. So this is kind of, we could just talk about this for 4 weeks. It's kind of a profound thing within itself. But nonetheless, there's these descriptors: profound, peaceful, beyond constructs, luminous, and unconditioned. So I like to reflect on these, because if enlightenment is not happiness and it's not suffering, what is it? And the Buddha said it's profound, it's peaceful. So there's this term peaceful, which again, we can define in different ways. It's beyond constructs. This is more difficult to define. We have to talk about emptiness and the nature of reality to define that. It's luminous. This is actually talking about qualities of the Buddha nature. And it's unconditioned. Again, a very difficult term, because if something's unconditioned, how do we experience it, right? So the reason I bring this up is not to confuse us, but it's to kind of break open, right? Where we can use the term Dharma not to sort of where we need to know something in order to feel safe, but actually we have to start to feel safety in not knowing. And that's part of why the terminology we use is breaking open into this curiosity beyond just fixing and linearity. So the suffering of change is a way to work with us, because we sit with our experience. We become mindful, we become aware of it. When we're sitting, how does the body feel? When we stand up, how does the body feel? So I felt pretty good sitting down with you all at the beginning of this. Not so much right now. My hips are hurting, you know? I got pain in my body. So what was that? Was that first moment happiness? And where did it change to suffering? Right? So these are the kind of inquiries we do. And of course, it's easier to do this when there's pain, harder to do it when there's pleasure. Like when I get an ice cream, I'm just like, whoop, ice cream's gone. And then I think about the suffering of change, right? So I'm not reflecting on it initially because we get kind of, there's I think Spadampa Sangye who said, great Indian master, sentient beings can handle a lot of suffering, but not much pleasure. And I really like that quote because it's kind of like that. We get so caught in pleasure, we forget to reflect, or at least I do. I forget to like engage it as a practice. But when we're working with the suffering of change, that's what we do. We watch our experience. We become watchful. How is my mind in relation to this pleasurable experience? How's my mind in relation to this unpleasurable experience? And we start to track that way. So there's not like a conceptual answer here. There's just you developing the knowing and understanding through practice. And the same with pervasive compounding suffering, though that's even more subtle. But this kind of relates to how we interpret identity and self, and how that's compounded in relation to karma and all that. So anyways, just giving you a few little things of like how we need to make meaning in the Buddhist path, or we make meaning in the Buddhist path through reflecting on both our potential, our Buddha nature, and also our predicament, the clouds, right? So we have to put time into both. And for me, I will say, maybe some of you have found this too in your practice, the more I sit with dukkha, the way it arises, and let my heart break within it, while staying open to curiosity, right? The more I learn, and that learning is not a conceptual understanding. That learning is an experiential understanding, and the more Buddhism makes sense, and actually the more we can connect into emptiness. That's why we talk about these 4 seals in Buddhism: the seal of impermanence, the seal of dukkha, the seal of emptiness, and the seal of nirvana. I always thought it was interesting. I've taught the 4 seals a few times, and I was like, why does dukkha come second? Like, why does suffering come second and not first? Impermanence comes first as an insight, meaning the more we meditate, we're going to sense impermanence first. And I thought, because, there's many reasons, but I thought dukkha and suffering is actually, it's harder to get at. And first we have to see change in action. First we have to relate to phenomena as not fixed and solid. And then we can start to relate how dukkha arises out of that, right? And we can start to experience that. So again, I'll leave it there for now because I want to move on. But I just wanted to mention that in connection to living a meaningful life, for me, comes in connection to all of what I experience, not just the pleasurable, happiness-based things. Because yes, we might come into the Dharma with this wish and this idea, yep, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to get happy, and all the clouds are going to go away, and it's going to be great. And then we're like faced with, oh shit, that's all my stuff, right? Right in our face more than it ever was. And some people might quit at this point, and or sort of go back to what I call kind of quick fix meditation. And it's all good. Everyone in their own time does what they need. But if we really want to, wake up, we have to be willing to sit with the uncomfortable. I call kind of like, the way I relate to my path is like getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Because the uncomfortable is also an illusion. Like, remember I talked about nightmare and good dream? The nightmare is like the uncomfort, the sadness, all of this kind of thing, the depression, the physical pain. And it feels so real to us right now, especially in the body. I struggle with that. I'm not that old, but as I age, I'm like, oh, there's a new thing I didn't experience before. Interesting, right? There's a new pain that I didn't have 3 years ago. And so it's this experience where, and it feels so real because it feels material, like we can touch it. But this is also illusory. It has a quality of illusion we can sense through practice. Just an illusion doesn't also mean it's not happening. So we have to sense that through experience. So So in a sense, we could say like meaning making is also working with our afflictions. It's working with what's arising. And now tying into lojong, and then I want to open up for some discussion between all of us. Lojong is specifically focusing on that. It's focusing on where the heart gets stuck, where it gets sort of boxed in and stagnant, right? And also how we're working with our afflictive emotions. So afflictive emotion, or klesha, is a term in Buddhism that refers to emotions that when we perpetuate or we feed, cause more of a nightmare in our life. So remember how I said first we work with the nightmare, sort of transforming the nightmare to a more positive dream, and then we try to wake up out of the dream state completely. That's really what the Buddhist path is. Working with our afflictive emotions through lojong is a way to work with that nightmare. And it's also a way to open our heart. So by nightmare, I mean here our anger, our aversion, our clinging, our craving, and our ignorance, where we act out of craving and aversion because we just forget, or we don't know, or we get caught up in our habit or our conditioning, right? So lojong is an incredibly skillful way to get to know our afflictive emotions and to transform them through developing bodhicitta, through developing a wish to take on other suffering and or sort of relate to others, relate our suffering to the suffering of others, which gets us out of ourself, which, yes, helps to remedy the afflictive emotions. So this connects to sort of also developing altruism. So we could say in Mahayana Buddhism, meaning making or living a meaningful life has to do with how we're living altruism, how we're developing that, how we're training in that, and how we're just experiencing and enacting that. And again, this is a training, right? And what I find interesting is it's also what the Buddha nature teachings are saying, just going back to that, is this is also innate. Compassion, love, altruism, interconnection, bodhicitta. These are things that we already have. It's just that they're kind of hidden. Like I said, they're obscured by the clouds, or we need to do something. We need to churn the milk, for the butter to come out. And so that's essentially what the Buddhist path is. It's just a set of methods and principles to allow us to bring out our natural qualities. And to me, this is an incredibly optimistic way to look at it, rather than I'm the shitty person who needs to become better, right? that's kind of the way our culture might teach us we're doing this. Like, I need to produce enlightenment, or I need to produce altruism or bodhicitta or, compassion. No, it's like, well, you already got it. It's just allowing that to come out more through practice. And so lojong, essentially, we make meaning through developing the altruistic mind of bodhicitta. So I want to introduce bodhicitta briefly, and I think a lot of you already know the concept of bodhicitta. And then, like I said, I'll stop the teaching today and we'll just engage with each other. Bodhicitta, translates as the mind of awakening. So we have bodhi, which is sort of this mind heart, bodhi meaning awakening, and chitta meaning this mind heart, and that comes together where we're both training in this heart mind of awakening, but it's also innate. It's something that we already have, and we're just bringing that out more. We can think of it that way. So bodhicitta has, as I'm sure you all know, it has levels of aspiring to that and ways of engaging that. Lojong, you could say, is more in the aspiration category, right? But I'm sure it eventually gets into the engaging category. So we're working with the mind. We're training in the aspiration of altruism. And aspiration is an incredibly important thing within Buddhism. I think it's undervalued in Western culture because we value so much more product, right? We value there being a thing we can see and touch and feel and okay, I did this. But for a Buddhist, you can't do that without the aspiration first. And often what happens is if we skip the aspirational and we move, we end up not getting we get kind of like what my teacher calls a made in Nepal product or a made in China product, not like those products can't be good, but often, they don't, sometimes the poorer, cheaper things, they don't have the quality, right? And so that's what we're doing through training and aspiration. And I think this gives us room too, with what I said earlier in the talk, which is we sometimes can read these lojong slogans and or what we're engaging here and sort of judge ourselves for not feeling it right away or not being able to do it right away. But if we understand what we're doing is aspiring, then also it gives us room and freedom to develop. Like, you have the room, how should I say this? We have the room to fail and be wrong and to make mistakes. This is part of the Buddhist path. Actually, you can't engage the Buddhist path without making mistakes. There's no possibility of it. There's a great teacher, Khenpo Sutram Gyamtso Rinpoche, who said, mistake after mistake, I travel the unmistaken path. And I was like, this is so good. Because I think as Westerners, we need permission that it's okay to make mistakes. Like I struggle with this in Buddhist ethics and vows. Because often the vow seems like, okay, the vow is here and I should never break this vow. And if I break it, I'm a terrible person. But actually the vow is there because you can't do it yet. Otherwise, why would you need the vow, right? I kind of think of it that way. If you already could do the vow, who cares? You don't need to take a vow. But we take a vow because we can't do it yet, and we train in it, and we break it, and we repair it, and then we keep going, right? And of course, here it depends on the level of vow we're talking about. Some vows, like a monk vow, if you break that, you're not a monk anymore. So there are repercussions for certain vows. But bodhisattva vows and tantric vows are a little more flexible in that way. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll talk more about bodhicitta next week. But I just wanted to introduce it in relation to meaning making. So I think what we can do now is just open it up, and feel free to unmute yourself. And if you have a question, go for it. If you have just something you want to share, go for it. The only requirement I want to have here is it's fine to ask intellectual questions. That's fine, because we're studying, we're learning right now. But if you're going to share something, share it from your heart, not necessarily from your head. Okay? So, sorry. I don't mean to make you shy, dude.
Scott, it's Nancy.
Hey, Nancy.
I really like what you're saying about what really spoke to me is that we don't want Buddhism to trap us in. And, I've sat with a Zen group and done some Vipassana and found the Tibetan, which is different, but sometimes you can feel like boom, 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 it's all in a box and you've got to follow this. So the fact that you just brought out the fact that Buddhism is about the freedom to explore, to fail, to grow. And I really, really appreciated that too. So thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think it took me 20 years to figure that out. like a lot of beating my head against the wall, and which is part of that, I think, right? Like we are where we are, and we have to kind of do our work. But yeah, thank you I appreciate your appreciation. Yeah, I just like, to me, maybe just share some of my experience, more of my experience. If I don't do that, I think my path is like dead. It's sort of like it's really stagnant, if I don't treat it like that. For me, and I just want to acknowledge, I'm glad that resonated with you, Nancy, but that might not be the way for everyone. I just want to point that out.
Well, the thing is, I have a practice that I've been giving, and I think that has really helped me kind of focus, and because I found TNL, I had consistent teachings, which I didn't have before. So sitting and meditating without the teachings, like you said, the path, you've got to have some ground. So that's what I so appreciate. And I love the teachers that we have, and I, listen, and that helps me grow. But to bring in other teachings and listening to you and other teachers as well, it helps expand that field a bit. So what I'm getting from TNL is consistent teachings and the Tibetan, and that has been really helpful. And then being introduced because of TNL and our great SPC, Mary, and Charmaine has just done so well as the CD, but bringing in other teachings and other teachers to expand that to the West has been good for me.
Yeah, so. Wonderful. Yeah, beautiful. I rejoice. Yeah, go for it, Mary.
Thank you, Scott. Oh, wonderful, wonderful insights and questions you posed. Just picking up where Nancy left off. It's really interesting how meeting this tradition where, at least for me, there was an immediate rigidity in my response to whereas, like, for example, wanting to lead pujas perfectly, just kind of like this, trying to, like, we see where it is and we want to do it perfectly. And I think that's also part of our culture. I also believe that when we don't know a lot and we have a lack of confidence, what we tend to do is just get rigid on the little bit that we know, because everything in the Tibetan Buddhism practice is a flexible mind, a flexible body, especially as we go deeper into the practice itself, right? If you think about it. And I just think it's our take on all of these things. And I also think that we have the amazing good fortune to receive so many teachings, which typically practitioners never have that opportunity. If you think about Tibetan Buddhism, where you get it all the time. So that means that we haven't had a chance to reflect on the teachings. We get, they're just coming one. I mean, how amazing this abundance that we have, but because we don't have a chance to sit with it and let it expand in our hearts and minds. So that was just my take on that. And I have a follow-up too with that, if I may.
Sure. Do you mind if I make a few comments on that?
Yes, go for it. Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, wonderful. I love your reflection there, and just sharing your experience around it. Just one thing came up to my mind based on what you're saying, which is, I think this edge we're exploring, and if we're interested in a living lineage Buddhist practice and we associate with that and we're using it as our path, it's this interesting edge that I'm always up against, where if we don't have, the tradition works, like the way they've organized the path and practices and the way we integrate learning, meditation, and reflection in Himalayan Buddhism, thousands of people have gotten enlightened through this, the very things we're studying and practicing. And so there's sort of that recognition. And then also the recognition, like what you just said, which is like, we come to it with our conditioning. And what I would say is, like, what I think is unacknowledged sometimes, just in general, but we can be more specific here, is that we come to this with a lens. We come to these things with a lens, and then we struggle, and we have this lens of perfectionism, when I think some of our Tibetan teachers, they get it because they've maybe lived here, and some don't. Some just have only been in Tibetan, and they're like, we say something, but it has no cultural context for them, because they don't struggle with perfectionism, or they don't struggle with low self-esteem or whatever. And so I think it's just, this interesting context of, like, I don't even use the word preserving anymore, because I think that can get quite stodgy. But the idea that, like, there is something to humble ourselves to, and to sit with and chew, right? Because, but at the same time acknowledge, like, how am I relating to that? And, what do I need when? And for me, that took time. So I think maybe it's just a natural process that, like, you were talking about confidence and how it takes time. And, part of perfectionism is around, like, struggling with that confidence. Maybe it's just like something we all have to go through, to a certain degree, maybe not the same way, but I went through that struggle, and then we kind of, like, we get burnt out. And then if we want to keep going, we have to break that. But it's like, to me, it's like having the container of the lineage and informing that container for us, over and over again. And then, as you were pointing out, Mary, then practicing the container is where we, where we do the chewing. And so I think that's kind of unfortunately, one of the difficult issues for us, because because our Western culture puts so much material demands on us that are not actually natural to human beings. It's a very new thing to have a 60 to 80-hour work week. And so when Tibetans were practicing these things, maybe they had, I don't know, I'm sure dependent on the person, maybe they had a 10 to 15-hour work week, like, tilling barley or something like that, or whatever. And they also had a culture where they integrated practice. So I think these are the growing pains that we have to discover together as communities and support each other, because there's not an answer to this right away. I figured out for myself, sort of. I mean, that's an ongoing process, but like 9 years as a monk was part of that exploration. But now I'm, a householder practitioner again. And inundated with busyness. And it's sort of like so it's like we each figure this out. But you're correct, Mary. I think if we don't put time into practice, then it doesn't have time to get digested. And then there's nothing really, all there is ideas and rigidity, kind of. You know what I mean? Anyways, sorry, I don't want.
No, I hear you. And I'm actually getting a lot of, the feedback that I do get from Geshe-la, Geshe Thupten Sherb, in some of the practices that I'm doing, is a flexibility, having variables, variety. And a lot of the things that he's saying also in classes is when we do, for example, meditation on Lam Rim or something, there's different ways to approach it. I think that perhaps we're not hearing that. We're and this also, I have to say, when you mention that enlightenment is not an end, it's the great opening. It's the great, it's limitless. I think a lot of it, it's how we are catching the information that we're getting. And again, it's part of it's also in our impatience. We want it right now. We want to, we don't want to really practice or work hard. It's pretty interesting, I think. But in my other small point was, I really enjoy how you bring a somatic experience into meditation. And, when you're talking about embodied, I think that's really important. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, that's a whole nother topic, but I want to focus more on your questions. And, but yeah, maybe each week I'll talk a little bit more about the somatic component.
Scott, this is Anna. Really enjoying it. I think an aspect that I appreciate being reminded that this is a process, this is a method of inquiry. And kind of what Nancy was saying earlier, it's iterative. So we have structure, we have the teachings, but then to sit back, think about it, put it into our own daily life and to question and apply it, which is often painful, not easy.
Yeah.
But then also remembering, and this is where I kind of lose it sometimes, that the Buddhism of any form, it's still a social construct. There's, form and emptiness and form, and reminding ourselves that also. And that's part of that inquiry too. And so it goes round and round and I get lost in it, but it's a fun ride. but just to remember that it is that process of inquiry, and there's different ways of asking at different times.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and you reminded me of a somewhat controversial teaching of Dzongchen Khyentse Rinpoche, where he started talking about the part of the Buddhist teachings as Cinderella teachings, and he's not diminishing or demeaning them through that statement. It's more just the statement that, when we come to the Dharma, we come with different capacities, and we sometimes need, like, some people just need someone to say, do that and don't do that. Like that's how it, almost like, kindergarten or first grade or something like that. And I'm not trying to demean or diminish any of us with that. That's just a natural part of learning something sometimes. And so the Buddha did that too, where there were certain teachings where, they're just a stepping stone to the next thing, where, someone who's not ready to hear form is emptiness, emptiness is form, the Buddha talked about, do this, don't do that, karma, cause and effect, impermanence and that kind of thing. And then when we start to digest that food and we start to grow our bones and muscles in practice, then we come into this form as emptiness. Emptiness is form, which means it's also not throwing out karma, cause and effect, impermanence, and ethics. But it's widening our field of how we're understanding that and relating to that. And so it's very skillful, you know, the way the Buddha engaged the path. But I think what's also interesting, and I heard this in what you were saying, that's why I'm just reflecting it back, is that now again, I think other spiritual traditions can offer this. I don't know, because I haven't really engaged them that much experientially. But to me, Buddhism is a spiritual path that is there to make itself redundant. And it's very rare for that reason. Meaning, it's there as a relative truth, as a relative thing we're engaging with. But as we engage, I was saying this earlier, we take one step to another and experience develops and widens, and that limitlessness and infinitude widens. As an individual, we don't need the path in the same way. And then at some point, as the Buddha said, you know, when the boat has gone to the other shore, you don't carry the boat onto the island with you. But of course, that statement is talking about, you know, full realization, full awakening. And so obviously we do need the path for quite a long time. Yet I think that acknowledgement that the path is relative and that the path is kind of a temporary means is healthy. It's a little bit what I was saying, like where a Zen master may bow with incense, knowing himself, the incense, the bow, the environment is all not separate. It's all interdependent and empty of true existence. So that's what we learn to do as we become grown-up Buddhists. We learn to engage the relative and the ultimate together, because that's what awakening is. It's the complete unification of relative and ultimate truth. And so it's yeah, so the path leads us to that unification. So I don't know, I just get so excited because to me this is like so inspiring. This is what inspires me on the Buddhist path. It doesn't inspire me so much like how many tankas I have in my house, or you know, how big my shrine is. Though again, on a relative level, that can be inspiring for us. Like I'm in Crestone right now, and this is one of my teacher's land. I'm on Soknir Mashe's retreat land called the Eshe Rangsel. And I walked in, and there's a shrine, and we have a big stupa here, and you know, all kinds of things. And I walked in, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's inspiring. It's nice to see pictures of my teachers around. It's nice to see deities and things like that. But what's the meaning? Like if I can't carry that into my life and see deities around me as a practitioner and relate to that, well, what's the point? It just becomes some kind of abstract piece of art. You know? So anyways, I'm kind of going on a tangent, but thank you.
Hi, thank you for the teaching. Well, I've been kind of like, I'm okay that we need to like follow a path in order to go more in depth on the teaching and the practice. But the thing is, how can I still feel myself? And when chanting or reading or doing some compassion, how can I really feel it and say it from the heart and not just yeah, with the brain or mind?
Yeah, really good question. Just to acknowledge first off that, just like we were saying, and some of the other folks here were saying, that's a process in and of itself. Meaning, like sometimes it's going to feel really rich and connected and you know, blissful and all of that, and sometimes it won't, right? And that's just a natural part of the process of sort of connecting to the Dharma. So the real answer is, like, as our experience develops through engaging the path and the chanting and the ritual and the study and all of it, as experience develops, then that appreciation and sense of heart develops. But I like your question because I think there is a deep need for this, like for modern people, this need to feel connected. And I think there are certain things we can do to start that from the beginning, even though that is a process and it's maybe not going to feel like that all the time. And I think for a lot of people, it depends on the person, but a lot of people understanding the meaning is this is why we emphasize teaching a lot in Tibetan Buddhism, because if we understand the meaning, then we have something, then we apply that meaning, something becomes meaningful. It's like, that's why I teach on a little bit like what refuge is, what bodhicitta is, what the mandala is. Otherwise, like when I showed up to Dharma centers first, it's hard for me because it takes time, and sometimes I don't want to waste people's time every time with it. But when I showed up to Dharma centers, they often just launch into long things. And I've sat through pujas without understanding anything. And for a Tibetan bodied person, a Himalayan bodied person, that was fine culturally. Like generally what they do first is they work on the muscle memory of something. Like monks will sit in a monastery and know all the mudras and ritual without knowing even what they're doing. And they're okay with that because they have community and connection, and sort of just like fun and something they're doing. And then later they learn the meaning. Where I think it has to be reversed for us. First we learn the meaning, then we engage the practice. We put it into practice. So that's one thing. The other is sort of emphasizing things that you connect with, like making that the majority. Like I'm saying this roughly, maybe 70 to 75% of your practice and study is something where you're like, okay, wow, that's so interesting. I want to go down that road more. And then you do that, and then leave 25% for the thing you resist, right? Or 25% for the thing you don't feel so passionate about. And what that leaves room for is like the 75% is going to, as you practice the thing you're passionate about, it opens passion for the thing you're not passionate about over time. Because the Dharma is like interconnected and interwoven. When we study bodhicitta, we're studying emptiness. When we study emptiness, we're studying compassion. When we study impermanence, we're studying this. So it's like, as our understanding links with experience, everything starts to come together. So when I practice impermanence, there may be a flavor of more impermanence, but everything else is in it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, yeah. But of course, there's many ways to do that. Some people like music or like art, because it's less conceptual and it opens the heart. So if you need that, making a tune that you feel really like, I really like that, or for me, sorry, I'm going to keep going just because I think it's an interesting question. What I'm really enjoying now, what's helping me to make my practice more alive, is I go sit out in the wild. Like I like sitting in nature and doing my practice. And there's something there where in the elements and in the wild, it's something like already it's like so much of the work is done for me. Like I feel open, and then I can engage the practice in an open way, So find that for you. That might be, unique to you. Okay, maybe we have time for one more. Anybody have anything? We could also end here. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I really enjoyed today. We'll continue. I was supposed to talk about verse 1 today, which I did more or less, but I didn't, go into the detail on it. So I'm just going to read it right now, so we can kind of have a way to connect with the verse, and then we'll start with that next time. So verse 1 says, "Determined to accomplish all success, I shall always practice holding dear all sentient beings who are more precious than wish-fulfilling gems." So reflect on that verse a little bit until our next teaching, and reflect on it if you want to, especially in connection with like what we talked about today. Because actually I did talk about more or less what that verse means, but just in kind of different ways. So bodhicitta, like this idea of success, which I would say meaning. Instead of success, I would replace that with the word meaning. Let's see how it would read if we did that. Determined to accomplish all meaning, I shall always practice holding dear all sentient beings who are more precious than wish-fulfilling gems. But like I said, we'll get more into bodhicitta next week, which is really the essence of that verse. Cool. So we'll do some dedication, and then tell your friends. People can still drop into this like next week. So if you want to spread the word, they're welcome to drop in. I think Mary recorded this, so hopefully we can get to that to people who show up, next week and didn't come today, and they can catch up. So in the same spirit as we sort of worked with the previous chants, we'll do some of these. And I think we'll just do it in English, just to connect with the meaning. So we'll do it slowly so you can allow the meaning, like the words, to wash over you. That's another way to engage this, doing it slowly and reflecting on it. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings, without exception, into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And again, drop into your heart. So we make the practice embodied here. Drop into your heart space or wherever in the body feels good to you. And let the words sink in as a feeling, as a actual like environment you're coming into. Even if it's just like teeny, 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 that's okay. Okay, so thanks everyone. I really appreciate you, and this was fun. And I look forward to next week.